Welcome back. My name is Rafael Chicona. I'm the director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our educational programming in conjunction with the fabulous exhibition of Richard S. Buswell, 50 Years of Photography. This exhibition runs at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture until August 28th, 2021. We hope you can visit us live, and you're also welcome to visit us online on our virtual docent tour. So if you're interested in that, please visit us at umt.edu/Montana Museum. I also want to take a second and thank our generous sponsors of this exhibition, an anonymous donor who made much of this show possible, Humanities Montana, the Montana Arts Council, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Thank you very much for your generous support of this wonderful exhibition. Today we have the pleasure of having an interview with the artist Richard S. Buswell. Richard will be interviewed by Eileen Rafferty. So let me start with a brief introduction. Richard S. Buswell is a photographer and a retired physician, a consummate artist, and someone who's on his 6th exhibition at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. So it really is a pleasure to have him back in our midst and to have his wonderful works here in Missoula. Eileen Rafferty is a photographer and videographer, and who is also taught at the Rocky Mountain School of Photography as well as the University of Montana as an adjunct in photo history and in photography. And Eileen will be interviewing Richard shortly. But before we begin, we always like to acknowledge that the University of Montana is on the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. We honor the path that they have always shown us in caring for this place for generations to come. And we at the museum like to add that art has always been a part of this place. So, without further ado, let me welcome Richard S. Buswell and Eileen Rafferty.
Hi, Rich. How are you?
Well, good. I'm not only well, but I'm impressed. I've been watching the production unfold here, and it's been impressive.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's a little more than hitting one button on your cell phone.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for being here for the interview. I've been chosen to interview you because of my photography background and darkroom background, and I thought maybe some technical stuff, the darkroom and the cameras and the film might be a good place to start. So I thought it might be interesting for you to talk about, and of course your cameras have probably evolved, but maybe when you started until now, you know, what cameras you used, you print yourself in the darkroom, what film you used, what paper, might be kind of an interesting place to start.
Well, a generic answer to your thought is for 50 years I've been using the same equipment. I've been using the same paper, same film, so I'm pretty familiar with that combination, actually. And the cameras are Nicormats, which is a baby Nikon, if you will. And when I was 2 years at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, I had other physician who shared an office space with me, and he had this camera called a Nicormat. I looked at it with him, and then I went ahead and ordered 2 myself, so I have 2 50-year-old Nicormat cameras. And over the years, I have accumulated 4 lenses, ranging from a fixed wide angle to a zoom and 2 telephotos as well. So I'm sort of the antithesis of a techie. The equipment is all 50 years old, and it still works beautifully. And the other thing about using equipment that old is you don't have to think through what you're going to do. It's become part of my nature, if you will. So I set up the tripod, put the camera with whatever lens you're going to be shooting, and after that, it's largely the Braille method. You know, you do the f-stops that you want, and you turn to the shutter speed that you want, and I know where it all is, so it's gotten pretty easy. But it's certainly there's not an automatic thing on any of the equipment. It's all manual.
Right. Yeah. The advantage also of shooting an old camera with film is you don't have to worry about constantly upgrading gear like we do with our digital cameras.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it's the same now as it was in 1971.
Right. Do you have a favorite film that you tend to go to, or do you experiment with different black and white films?
Oh, well, over the years, I've probably used 2 or 3 different films. The one I've been using for several years, maybe several decades, is a T-Max 400. And I like it because the equipment is 35 millimeter, and grain bothers me. So when I enlarge the negative, I can't see the grain. So I have the advantage of having a little faster speed with the 400, but at the same time, not distracted by grain.
Right. It
Yeah.
has that nice, smooth,
Mm-hmm.
and it has a beautiful tonal range, that film as well.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And almost all of what I do is 8x10s. So if there's grain, it's pretty hard to see. Were I to enlarge those to 16x20s or something like that, I'm sure you'd see the grain, but I don't see the grain anyway.
Why the 8x10 format? Why has that become your choice and scale?
Well, some of it's a practical issue. Is that my darkroom, I have my own darkroom. I do my own darkroom work, film to paper, and toning is all done. Part of it's limited by how high the ceiling is.
Right.
So it's in the basement where the climate is, I mean, it doesn't change more than 2 degrees
Right.
during summer or fall, and the humidity isn't very much either. But the ceiling is maybe 18 inches above my head. So part of it, if I were to go to make a 16x20, I'd have to move the ceiling up.
Right.
So, some of it is just a practical consideration. Plus, I am bothered by grain, and I don't think you'll see grain on these, or very much anyway. So if I were to create 11x14 or 16x20, I'm pretty sure I would be bothered
Right.
by grain.
It's nice to have this smaller, meaning not 16x20, 20x24,
Yeah.
because it makes it intimate. The viewer has to get close to really begin to explore the photograph and
That's
see the
right.
detail.
Yeah, and looking back over the 50-some years that I've been doing this, early on it was more representational work, the big picture, if you will, the big barn or the big cabin or whatever. For the last, I don't know how many decades, my eye has been dwelling more on close-up. And I have a close-up lens, which has fast become my favorite lens. It'll focus down to 4 inches, and you can see some things with the close-up lens you would ordinarily not see. But when you force yourself to compose with a close-up lens, you get a better representation of what you're trying to photograph.
Right, right. I'll get there eventually, because I was going to ask you how your work has evolved in 50 years. It's a long time to be shooting.
Yeah.
But I wanted to back up a little bit, especially because you were talking about the representational work and more of the wide view and shooting or printing an 8x10. We had lunch earlier, and you mentioned that you met Ansel Adams. I
Yep.
was wondering, who would you say early on in your photography were your influences?
Well, for one thing, I'm entirely self-taught. I haven't had lessons at all. So I learned by the school of hard knocks, where you have a favorite negative and it should be printing this way, but it didn't turn out that way. So you start over again, and I guess an answer to your question is it's self-taught, but in self-teaching, I've read a lot. Ansel Adams, as you may know, has several books out, and I've read all of those cover to cover, took careful notes, educating myself as well. And it was truly a pleasure and an honor to meet Ansel Adams in Carmel, California, where he lives. So that's a treasured memory.
Yeah. Did you have any other early influences, I'd say in the first maybe 15 years or 10 years of your photography?
Well, I've read widely. That's how I've educated myself, and Edward Weston comes to mind as well.
Yeah.
Brett Weston, one of his sons. In terms of personal introductions, the only one that I can claim that has some acclaim is Ansel Adams. But reading the books, there's a lot of information on those.
Not a shabby one if you're going to meet one photographer from photographic history, that it's Ansel Adams.
Yeah, if you had to choose one.
Yeah. I think Edward Weston is an interesting influence because like your work, when we think of Ansel Adams, we mostly think of the broad, wide landscape. I mean, he did do some details as well.
Yeah.
But Edward Weston shot so many different focal lengths, so many different subject matter. I mean, when I think of Edward Weston, I think of someone who could photograph anything.
Yep.
And looking at, the retrospective of your work here, you also, some are broad, some are mid, some are close. Your subject matter varies. So that's, I think, I can see the correlation of his influence, the Edward Weston influence.
And again, early on, the work was largely representational, the big picture, if you will.
Right.
And after a while, you sort of run out of places you haven't seen before when you're doing the big picture like that. So with that in mind, then it's driven me to start doing closer and closer and closer examinations of these old things that I photograph.
Yeah,
Opens up a whole new world when you do close-up work
this is
that
true.
you ordinarily wouldn't see.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk then about, because my next question was going to be about your subject matter. And, especially the work we're looking at here, and most of the work that you've done, you said, has been on homesteads or ghost towns, and of course you're a native Montana, born and raised in Helena.
Correct.
So, why do you think that you're drawn to that particular subject matter so much, and that you were able to focus on that particular subject matter for so long?
Well, one answer to that is it's very provocative, especially when you find old stuff and it's still there from the 1800s. That in itself is provocative. Secondly, as I may have mentioned earlier, among my earliest remembrances were hiking into ghost towns with my parents, and seeing them early on in life. So it's been imprinted, if you will, on my neurons.
Right.
Since probably age 4 or 5. And then when I would come home from medical school and residency and fellowship, in addition to seeing my folks, I would then disappear into the mountains and look for ghost towns. So I've been doing this genre of photography for 50 years, literally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I still have more places to visit.
Yeah.
That's the other thing that's interesting about this, is you think after 50 years, you've seen it all.
Right.
It's not the case.
Yeah.
For one thing, the subject matter sometimes changes. What I photographed 30, 40 years ago is now dilapidated, which has its own aesthetic
Right.
to it as well. So most of the time I'm visiting places that I haven't seen before. And after 50 years, there's still more to see, more to come. But on occasion, I will revisit something that I've seen before. And because of the decades that have gone on, it has a different aesthetic now than it used to have.
Right.
So,
And Rich, do you mostly, the ghost towns, the homesteads, the dilapidated buildings, are those mostly shot in Montana, or is it the western U.S. in general?
no, it was just Montana.
Just Montana.
And just western Montana.
Wow.
I had a practice of medicine. I was solo practitioner, so most of the time I couldn't get very far away from the phone.
Right.
So to go to eastern Montana when I was practicing was kind of out of the question,
Sure.
really. But I could find a day's worth or sometimes a weekend's worth in western Montana that made it practical to photograph.
Yeah. I love that. That's fascinating. I've taught photography for many years, and that's testament to the students who say, I can't find anything to shoot, right? The fact that you've shot in the same region
Yeah.
in a similar subject matter for 50 years, and that you say, there's, I still haven't seen everything.
Yeah.
That also, is a testament to your, not only your excitement for the medium, but your ability to really slow down and your honed vision, I guess I would say.
Yeah, and what's also kind of a corollary to that is in 50 years, what's left to explore? Well, I keep a master list at home, I call it, of places that occur to me or I've read about or whatever. And then they go on the master list. And then when I'm in that area, whatever it is, I'll take a diversion and go see this or go see that. So
Right.
I sometimes jokingly say, well, what haven't you seen in 50 years? A lot. Still. Now my problem is living long enough to see them, because I'm 76 now and in good health, can still hike and still carry my equipment in, but I'm not a teenager anymore. So.
Well, and it's interesting just to know, earlier you'd said that Yale University has your entire collection.
They do.
And I love you said that you still continue to shoot and you still contribute your images to the collection.
Yeah, and so far they've been continued to collect everything that I produce. So I just finished recently printing the 2020 shoot, I call it, this season. And when I have completely, I'm going to send it back to Yale for their collection consideration. Thus far, they've collected everything I've produced, which is mind-boggling to me in a way. But
that's excellent. That's
yeah.
that must be an honor.
It
And
is.
also to know that when you're gone,
yeah.
someone is taking care of it and it's all in one place. And
Yep, it's a climate-controlled setting and safely ensconced in vaults in some cases. So
wow.
yeah, it should be around for a long time,
Yeah.
barring nuclear holocaust.
Yes. Well, it survived a pandemic. So.
Yeah, right.
So we were just talking about your subject matter, and that you've shot these abandoned places for 50 years.
50 years,
right?
yeah.
I have a quote that was in one of the museum's publications. This is from you. Quote, "My work is more interpretive and abstract rather than documentary," end quote. Can you say a little more about that?
Sure. The subject matter, ghost towns and homesteads, is a popular subject matter because it has a spiritual side to it, it has an aesthetic side to it. One of the tricks not tricks isn't the right word, but one of the challenges is a better choice of words when I photograph these places is trying to photograph something I haven't seen before, not only in my own work, but in books as well. So I don't shoot a lot of negative during the course of the year, and I don't make many prints, but the ones that I do are usually have a freshness about them that I haven't seen before.
Right.
Yeah.
And we were talking earlier, you said you shoot in all natural light.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
And it looks like from the work in here that you shoot in all seasons as well.
I do, and most of what is in here are timed exposures, not all of them, but some. So you're inside a dark old barn or dark old cabin, and there's not enough f-stops to expose it properly. So I end up doing, actually I use my watch. It's
Sure.
5 seconds, and then if you're in a difficult lighting situation, as you know from being a photographer, sometimes you deal with what's called reciprocity failure, where you really don't know what the proper exposure is. So if I've gone 100 miles to see something and then tracked in, to see it, I will take what I think is the exposure, and then I'll bracket maybe half a stop overexposed and half a stop underexposed. And especially when you're doing dark interior work, you really don't, at least I don't really know what the exposure is. I ballpark it and then cover my tracks with a little bracketing on either side.
Yeah.
So that saves a lot of mileage when you go 100 miles, to
Yeah.
come back with a negative.
Yeah. And with film, of course,
Yeah,
for
that's
those of you who haven't shot film, there's only so many exposures on a roll, and you have only so many rolls in your pocket.
That's
so
right.
it's not like digital, right, where you can shoot thousands and thousands of images.
Yeah, I know.
Yep.
And that's wonderful, the people who do the digital, but on the other hand, I don't think you have to think as much with the digital imaging as you do with film.
Right.
Yeah. I'm still one of those old timers who does film.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I mean, there's been a real resurgence in the last, since digital, but certainly in the last 15 years of a lot of younger people as well wanting to learn film and go back to the darkroom, because I think they potentially miss the tactile quality of it, and also the fact that you have full control. I thought it was interesting that you said you read all of Ansel Adams' books, because his books were it was the negative,
and
the print,
and
the camera.
And the darkroom,
Yeah.
and the camera, and was one other, I think.
Right. Highly technical and really challenging to read.
Yeah.
But it's it's interesting that that you learned so much through his books, and he very much was about being in control of the process
Yeah.
from the very beginning, and often revisited the same places as you are, right? To the very end, that print at the end.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of come back around to the question when you said your work is more interpretive and abstract rather than documentary. What do you think is, in your opinion, the interpretive part of it? I mean, certainly as a photographer, as an artist, you can have your own history and interpretations and emotions when you make the image, and then the viewer is going to have their own history and interpretations and emotions when they view the image.
Exactly right.
Right, and that's not something we can necessarily control. We can hope, but we can't control. But you know, when you say interpretive, what do you think of as far as, is that because earlier you had mentioned that the subject matter can be quite spiritual?
Yes, it can. And I'm not a religious person historically at all. But when I have a composition in my viewfinder that I think is going to make a great shot, there is kind of a, for lack of better words, a spiritual feeling that comes over me. So it's a good feeling to have.
It is.
And then when you develop the film and you make the contact prints, if you in fact nailed it, that's even more spiritual.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think also the subject matter that you choose, this place where, you know, where people used to live, right? Some of these places were homes to people. I mean, ghost towns were towns and villages where whole communities lived for generations, and here you are photographing these places that used to be, you know, populated.
And that's part of the spirituality of it. You enter into an old building and there might be a cup sitting on the windowsill. And then it makes me think, and I'm sure the average person, who was that person who was drinking from the cup? And more often than not, you don't know the land records, if you will, but it adds to the feeling of spirituality when you see artifacts, not just a building, but things that people utilized that are still there.
Right.
And that's one of the perks of Montana. Is it's a huge state, for one thing. Many of these places are difficult to access with my Jeep or by walking or hiking. So in some cases, they are intact. The cup is still there, or the dish plate is still there. Well, for one thing, I feel honored to see it, because most people will not have that opportunity. But it really does add to the sense of spirituality.
Yeah.
I'm in somebody's house. Who was that person? Did they have children?
Right.
How many children did they have? And then the other thing that's spiritual, but depressing as well, is when you're at a place that has, let's say, 2 or 3 or 4 buildings, all abandoned, but still there. Up on the hill is the cemetery. And they usually, if you have enough buildings, there's going to be a cemetery, and it's usually up on a hill in a clearing. And you go up there and look at the markers, the grave markers. And in some cases, the child was 5 or 3, or something like that, and they probably got some horrible disease like diphtheria that we can prevent and treat. And back then, they didn't have that option. They died as a child or as an adult, or whatever. And so that realization that contributes to my sense of spirituality as well.
You know, the other question I wanted to ask you, because we've been talking about the fact that you've been photographing for 50 years. I mean,
The subject matter. Yeah.
right, and the same subject matter in the same region,
Right.
and that you still find interesting and new things. I mean, one of the things that really impresses me and interests me is I teach and lecture a lot about creativity, and have studied creativity for a very long time, and it just fascinates me, and I love hearing artists talk about the creative process. And, you know, I guess I have many questions about that for you, but one is, you know, how have you stayed motivated in 50 years with the same medium, black and white photography in the darkroom.
Mhm.
Have you found that your creativity and your desire has ebbed and flowed over 50 years? Has it grown since you've retired, right? I mean, how have you stayed connected and motivated within the medium for that many decades?
Well, I have, for one thing. It's still a very meaningful, refreshing, if you will, subject matter to find and then to photograph it as well. And I can't recall off the top of my head saying, I'm tired of doing this. It still uplifts me,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, to find something and to photograph it and have the photograph turn out as well. The creativity in it is essential to the continued interest in it, and finding some place new that I haven't seen before, composition that I haven't seen before, really invigorates the sense of creativity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you had said when you first started photographing, it was more about the broad view,
The big picture.
The big picture, as you
Yeah.
said, right? And looking at this, in this gallery now, at this retrospective 50 years, you can certainly see how, you could say it's the same subject matter in eastern Montana, similar location, but the subject matter, the actual photographs, what's in each photograph really varies. Meaning, some of them are close up, some of them are wide, some of them are, have this surrealist, perhaps there's the one that we're looking at on that wall right behind us, the one of the mask,
Yeah.
and then the one of the eyes. I think the eyes are from some sort of doll. Some of them have this surreal quality.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, it seems that there's also still this excitement in what you can possibly find.
Yeah.
But what I would say is your style, even though your medium and location and subject matter, we could say have remained the same, stylistically, these are very different in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, earlier on we said representational
Right.
was predominated with what I was doing, and now it's more close-up work and more abstract as well.
Mm.
So you look at some of these photographs, and the one directly over your left shoulder there, and those haytongs as well. To my mind, that's very abstract. And it's fun to see something that I haven't seen before, for one, because I've seen a lot in 50
Right.
years.
Yeah.
To see something that I haven't seen before, and then to photograph it and have that photograph turn out well adds to the interest and keeps me from being bored with it, I guess.
Yeah. We were talking earlier that you said one of your big passions is art history.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think it's interesting if you walked through this exhibit of 50 years, I certainly saw, potential influence from surrealism or Dada or the California modernists,
Yep.
who was the F-64 group, the
Uh-huh.
Weston and the Ansel Adams and Imogen Cunningham, and then certainly abstract photography. And because you are so aware and educated in art history, self-educated, as you said, do you think that throughout the years there was this conscious awareness of, this is my surrealism phase, or this is my modernist phase, or how much has that influenced, do you think, the way you were shooting?
Well, I read a lot in 50 years, and so probably some of what I did, I didn't realize had a label, whether it's surrealist or whatever, but by virtue of having done this photography for so long and having read so much as well, I can look back on it and say, wow, that's pretty surreal, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Like the photograph that you just pointed out back there is provocative. Some people feel it's ugly, but I think it has its own beauty to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
There you
of course.
go. That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. Looking at the images here, there are some of them that do allude to the Native American peoples living on this land. So, especially as a native Montanan, what's your take and interest photographically and historically on these places that you're photographing? That there were people and populations that lived there before the family that's now on the grave site and the hill above the town, as we said. Could you talk a little bit just about your, your perspective
Sure.
as a Montanan?
The first thought that comes to mind, Eileen, is that the largely Anglo subject matter that I'm photographing is very recent history in the big picture. And that same spot that I'm photographing was occupied for how many centuries, how many thousands, how many millennia by Native Americans. So one of the things that I am very aware of wherever I am is this was originally Native American country. And then we Anglos built our houses on it, or our barns, or whatever, but it was really Native Americans. And to try to find some artifacts from the Native American time is hard to do. So you won't see very many photographs of Native American artifacts, some, but not a lot. And that's just because of their scarcity more than anything else.
Well, and it's interesting when we talk about it too, because here we are talking about the fact that you've been photographing for 5 decades. It feels like a really long time, right? And then we're talking about these communities that, the Anglos have lived for, 100 years.
Right.
And even earlier, we were discussing the archivalness of the photographs and the fact that you print them in the darkroom and selenium tone them to make them more archival. You said hopefully they'll last for several hundred years. So it's, we're talking of this time frame as if it's huge. Hundreds, you hope that your photographs will be around for 300 years. We are, photographing, living, breathing on this land that belonged to people who were here for centuries, right? And as Raphael pointed out, are still here, living and vibrant in their communities.
Right.
And so it is interesting, thinking about not only the longevity of your photographs, will they last for hundreds of years, and Yale University will keep them and store them, but also the fact that you're photographing subject matter that is dilapidating, that is going away. And you even mentioned that you can revisit the same places 30 years later that are in a completely different state that they were 30 years before. I'm sure you've probably had the experience. Have you gone back to some of these places and they've been gone? Or,
In some cases. So I oftentimes have a sense of urgency because I'm not getting any younger. The weather is taking its toll on these places, so if I'm going to see them, I better start doing it.
Yeah.
But there are so many venues, I guess, of places to photograph. And when I was practicing medicine especially, it was just difficult to get away, to go visit these places. Now that I'm an old retired guy, I have more time, flexibility, if you will, to try to see. And limited by weather, you just, at least I cannot access these several months out of the year because they're high, they're cold, they have snow as well, so you have a limited window to try to see them and hopefully photograph them.
Yeah, I love that. I had a grad school colleague, one of my dear friends, who used to say, limitations are really good for our creativity.
Yeah.
Whether for you as a physician, that was time, now it's place or season or accessibility or this urgency that you might get there and it might not even be there anymore.
Yeah.
Or you saying, I'm not going to be on this planet for, 60 more years,
Right.
50 more years, who knows?
Yeah.
But those limitations can really fuel our creativity and our desire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Better get it now.
Yeah. Yeah. I was curious, talking about the archivalness of the prints, and certainly in the generation where you were learning photography, were you learning in the 70s? Is that when you began?
I got my first camera and darkroom experience in 1971.
Okay, 71.
So I think that's literally 50 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
Ago? Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about, when I was preparing for the interview, I was thinking about the time frame within photography, and I was thinking about the California Modernists, the F64 group.
Right.
Certainly through photographic history, when color film came about, all of the serious artists really snubbed color film because it wasn't serious enough, it wasn't artistic enough, right? And they saw color film was, eventually being used for advertising and fashion, and that became the commercialized way of making photographs. And then when amateurs and handheld cameras came about and people were using, everybody could make photographs, then color became for the amateur and not for the serious professional. So it's really embedded in photographic history that, black and white is the serious artistic way of making photographs. So I'm curious with you, why the choice of black and white? Why staying with black and white? And then also, there's plenty of people who shoot black and white and didn't go to the lengths of being in the darkroom and actually printing. So where was that desire for you, and how has that evolved? And the fact that you still print in the darkroom is pretty impressive.
One dynamic to mention to you is these sites that I photograph are oftentimes monochromatic to begin with. They're not real colorful.
Right.
So black and white as a medium oftentimes is a very suitable medium for these places I photograph. Now, were I doing roses, black and white, not so much.
Right.
But for these old places. And then you touched on it earlier that the permanence has been a important consideration for me, because again, I'm going to be gone someday. These buildings are going to be gone someday. But presuming my negatives are preserved somewhere, a museum, whatever, then theoretically anyway, they should be around for a long time.
Yeah.
And I do process the film, I do process the prints with archival preservation in mind. In and of itself, black and white is a pretty permanent medium, but when you print a black and white photograph and you tone it with selenium or gold, both of whom are inert metals, it imposes itself, if you will, on top of the silver. So instead of a silver gelatin print, which is a fancy word for a black and white print, it's now a silver selenide gelatin print. So there's that extra time that's required, that extra effort that's required. But I think it's time well spent, effort well spent, because they are going to be gone at some point in time, and this will hopefully be around for centuries.
Well, I think that's also such great foresight. It's easy to say now when you're 76 and you've been photographing for 50 years, oh, I better preserve this, but that you started 50 years ago and already had in mind that you wanted to.
I did.
To make sure that these prints,
And Ansel Adams, in some of the books that I've had and read, touches on archival preservation too. And I don't mean to demean color. Color has its own aesthetic, wonderful, but as a permanent medium, black and white is heads and shoulders more permanent than a color negative or a color print as well. A way around that is to freeze, which I haven't done. But if you have color negatives or color prints and they are going to fade, I think you can stick them in the freezer, along with the roast beef. And
So you process your own film as well?
Yeah,
wow,
film,
so you really are.
Everything that I do myself, except for the framing. That's the only thing
that's so rare. I mean, it really is rare, especially today.
Well,
even then it would have been, but to do every step, along the way yourself is very unique.
Well, again, I take 15 to 20 negatives per year, but they're usually good because I've been doing this for so long.
Right.
But I'm not a techie, for one thing, as I shared, and I'm not a proliferative photographer either. It's a very select imagery that I end up shooting.
Have you found over time, especially after 50 years, that it's getting difficult for you to find some of the materials?
Yeah, not the film so much. This film is still readily available, but when I first started out in the early 70s, there were all kinds of companies that manufactured paper in different tonalities and any more. What I'm using now is AGFA papers, which is German, or I think that's predominantly where it is. And fortunately, I really like the paper. There are basically two kinds of black and white photography paper. One is variable contrast, where you control the contrast with filters. I have never done that. I don't even own a filter to do that. And the other is controlling the contrast with paper. Grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4. It used to be a grade 5 as well, not anymore. So historically, what I've always done is use different contrasts of a paper. And then if you have to fine-tune the contrast, a grade 3.5, grade 3 3/4 or whatever, I will control that with developers. Instead of a standard 1:2 dilution, I might use a 1:3 or a 1:4. So it's kind of an older way of controlling contrast again, but I've been doing it for so long that it's not onerous for me.
Well, and certainly when I look at the prints, you know, I'm a former darkroom printer as well, and I mean the tonal range that you're getting, first of all, but then the deep, rich blacks and the bright whites and the variation of grays in between. So certainly whatever you're doing, you're getting the most out of the film and the paper.
Yeah, and oftentimes, as we mentioned before, it's a matter of trying grade 1. Well, that doesn't work. And grade 2, that still doesn't work. Grade 3, getting closer, you know, to grade 4. So there's a fair amount of paper that gets wasted when you have a photograph that you want to really work on, and then you finally, hopefully, get a result that you're happy with.
Well, it's one of the things I've always loved about photography is that creative visual side of it, but then it's a very technical, scientific medium.
Yeah,
and I would think as a physician,
Yeah.
you know, that the methodical, especially in the darkroom where you have to be methodical, you have to take notes because you need to recreate what you've done before. You can't go in there willy-nilly.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're raising that because I take copious notes. I take notes of where I was when I got that photograph. I take notes of the process that I've gone through in the darkroom, and it's all preserved. Now, what's going to happen to it is something that keeps me awake at night, because I think there's some historically valuable background or notes about what I've done.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So,
Well, hopefully whatever fortunate museum gets to have, we know Yale has all of your prints, but maybe there's another museum who would want your notes and your, you know, I mean, we have the notes of Edward Weston, right?
Yep.
Or your notes and your negatives, and right, because the methodology and is really important in photography.
yeah,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is kind of old-time methodology.
Yeah.
Yeah. Proportionally few people do this anymore.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for sitting down and talking with me.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Rich, we thought it'd be interesting to look at some of the photographs in the exhibit. We had talked about the influences of the isms, you know, surrealism, modernism, maybe the Dadas. And so, you know, we chose these two in this corner here. These two feel very surrealist to me, right?
Okay.
And surrealism was very much about the subconscious or the dream world, right? Not here and now, not reality. The artists that worked within surrealism. And so, you know, this one, for instance, of the abandoned room, but with the trees coming through the window, you know, in the context of surrealism, like, what do you think when you look at that photograph now, knowing what you know about surrealism? You had said, you know, when you made these photographs in the 70s, you might not have consciously been going, oh, this is surrealist. I'm making a surrealist photograph. But now, knowing what you do know about those art movements, let's talk, you know, a little bit about these images.
Let me just emphasize that too, because they do have, in some cases, an abstract feeling.
Yeah.
Some have a surreal feeling. When I took these, for example, in the early years, I'm not sure I knew what surrealism was. And I wasn't thinking in terms of that or abstract art as well. But to comment on these two specifically here, the interesting sidebar story about this is it was a ghost town where there was a dog who just was wandering aimlessly around, and I didn't know if the owner was somewhere in the hills or whether this was an abandoned dog or whatever. And to begin with, when I got into this area, the dog was going to chew me up and spit me out and have me for lunch. He was really quite upset.
Right.
Well, after a while, I just stood still and let him sniff me over and decide I was okay or not okay.
Yeah.
We became good friends, the dog. So much so that when I had seen this photograph in the summer months, and I said that would make an interesting photograph with snow on the floor. So I went back in the winter months. The dog was still there, and he remembered me, attached himself to me. And as I look at this now, the dog was right down here, and I said, no, don't go any further.
Because you didn't want the prints on the snow?
It looks undisturbed. And if there were dog prints in it,
right.
that would disturb the composition.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the cute story with this, is the dog who adopted me,
Yeah.
as you might say.
Yeah.
And who wanted to help out.
Right,
by
right.
scoping this out.
Yeah.
And I also, in the summer months, saw the tree through the windows, and that composition appealed to me. So I waited until the winter and went back there and set up my tripod, and the trees are still coming through the window. The ceiling is peeling, which adds to the aesthetic, I think. And the snow definitely does. It was strong enough, it blew in on the floor.
Yeah.
And fortunately, the dog did not get on the floor.
Yeah.
Although, as I thought about it, if there were dog prints in there, in a way that might add to the aesthetic.
Well, and certainly if we're talking about surrealism,
Yeah,
right? Because
yeah.
this is supposed to be,
Good point.
this is supposed to be this abandoned, forgotten place from another time, and and if it's fresh snow and there's prints,
Yeah,
right? There's
yeah.
obviously something living there,
Yeah.
right?
And there was no dog, just the prints.
The surrealists would have loved that. I think also, when I look at this image and think of surrealism, like I said, when I think of surrealism, I think of otherworldly, the subconscious, dream worlds, right? Anything that wasn't present day reality is what the surrealists were so interested in.
Right.
And, and I think that's something, you had said earlier when I read your quote about your images being interpretive, rather than documents. I love this because it's very mysterious, and then also just the symbolism of the window and looking through the window and the light coming through the window. You're in this darkened place that's dilapidated and run down, yet there's this freshly fallen snow. And then, just the symbolism of windows and what they represent, the potential for beyond, right? And this image for me is very dreamlike. When I look at it, my imagination takes flight. I can think of, I don't just think of standing in that place. I think of going beyond and what else this could represent to the viewer, right? Yeah.
Good points.
Yeah, well, thanks.
Yeah.
And then this one of the broken piano, I said this, I feel like this would be a Man Ray image. Man Ray, one of the great surrealists, photographers. But the other thing about the surrealist thing is they would always, and the Dadaists, would often take everyday common objects and do funky things with them, or make them represent something else, right? As Duchamp and all of his, wheels and the urinal and all the great things that they did with their regular objects. And, this is, we could say simply broken piano keys, but yet it does also have this mystery to it. And I thought about earlier when you said, when you go to these places and you think, who did this belong to? This cup that I found, or these shoes. And you think, when I look at this piano, it's hard to not hear the sound of the piano and think about that someone used to play this. Yeah.
Well, the other sidebar with this one here, a little cabin out in the middle of an extensive field. There's a rattlesnake underneath this cabin. And I learned that because I rode 2 stairs to get up to the level, and I could hear him.
Oh, wow.
Rattling underneath the cabin.
Yeah.
And he continued to rattle the whole time that I took this picture.
Wow.
Didn't see him. He didn't threaten me. Anyway. He just made it known that's where he was.
Yeah.
And stepped lightly.
Interesting that these places you visited, you had all these spirit animal creatures with you.
Well, the rattlesnakes, I've seen 5 bears in my years of doing this, but they were all more afraid of me than I was of them.
Yeah.
Took off. Rattlesnakes will stand their ground.
Yeah.
So I'm particularly aware of rattlesnakes and wear boots in case I didn't hear them or whatever. But I can remember the rattle.
I love that the soundtrack for me to this image is piano playing, and for you is a rattlesnake. I love that.
Yeah. And what it was doing on the porch. So it wasn't inside the old cabin, it was on the porch.
Wow.
So that was an interesting concept. And if you look closely, you'll see what are those stops, or the buttons up here.
Mm-hmm.
They were set in a particular way, so it kind of makes you wonder what were they playing when they left.
Right. Yeah.
Was there a particular tune that they were playing? So,
wow. Interesting.
sky's the limit as far as imagination when you visit these places.
It is.
What did they do? Did they have children or not? Did the children survive or not?
Yeah.
Because diphtheria was a huge problem,
Right.
especially in 1890.
And I think the sky is the limit, with good art.
Yeah.
Art that when a viewer can come to it, the sky can be the limit. Their imagination can go wild.
And what you see, I may not see.
Right. Yeah.
Vice versa.
Yeah. So I love maybe these objects that we could call, everyday objects or mundane objects or found objects. There's a universal quality to them as well, right? I like that they're not just this direct story, as soon as you look at it, you know the story, because they are these common objects that you're finding and photographing. It lets the viewer come to it and kind of make up their own narrative, their own story, especially something, the piano certainly, but for that window, I think that 50 viewers could come look at that and all come away with a different interpretation, a different feeling.
Then I've accomplished something when you get that much insight from different people.
Right, yeah.
That may or may not have occurred to me when I took the photograph.
Sure, yeah.
But hearing somebody like yourself comment about something I may not have thought about is a refreshing thing to do.
Yeah, it keeps it exciting, doesn't it?
It is, yeah. So most of the photographs in the exhibition, there are 72 photographs here, have little stories behind them, and we're going to be limited by time as to how much I drew on. But this one is also interesting in the sense that the roof was covered in cactus, and I've seen lots of old roofs, with old tiles and in many cases wooden tiles. This one, the entire roof, both sides, was covered with prickly pear cactus. Wow. Yeah, and it made me wonder, why did they choose cactus to put on top of their roofs? And the whole roof was as you can see, was just composed of cactus.
This image as well, when we were talking, that could have a surrealist quality to it, but I was thinking when we were talking about the modernists, the California modernists, we called the F-64 group, right? And they were so much about the design of the photograph, right? Not only, the photograph being sharp and having, a large depth of field, but also about geometric lines, shapes, textures. The very opposite of the surrealists, they were about using the camera to show reality, reality as it is, right? Actually depicting the world as you see it, what the camera was invented for originally, right?
And with F-64.
Right, with the largest aperture that your camera can attain, whatever, that was for the large format cameras, right? And so this one, I really think of that because you have this large depth of field, it's very geometric, and also the, California modernists were very much about light and shadow. Like light and shadow was a part of one of their tools.
Right.
Light should always be a photographer's tool, but sometimes we forget that. And so when I look at this one, right next to the more surrealist images, I think of the California modernists, right? Yeah. You said maybe when you were photographing, you weren't, going, now I'm being a modernist, now I'm being a surrealist. But later, now that you have that knowledge and you reflect back, especially seeing a room with 50 years of your work, what must that feel like, right?
Well, I learned things about photographs that I made from talking to people like you.
Yeah.
You see something I didn't see, or you have a knowledge that I didn't have when I took that. So it's been especially fun talking to you and the rest of the staff here. Yeah. Because you bring your own visions to what I took. Right. And again, I want to emphasize, I didn't take this or this or this because it represents surrealism, I wanted to have, or abstract or whatever. I took it because I responded to it, something innate in me said, that's a photograph. And then later on, talking to people like you, well, yeah, that is surreal. Yeah. Well,
and so many of the movements were that way. Some of them declared, this is who we are. We are the Dadaists. We are the surrealists. This is what we're doing. But, there's also so many movements that were called that after the fact, right? The artists were just responding to their environment and their circumstances, and then the ism got labeled afterwards.
Yeah. That's me.
Yeah.
That's I.
Wow, I wish we could go to every image and talk about it, but
Me too,
yeah,
yeah.
maybe we'll do that off camera.
It's been a very fun afternoon.
Yeah, it
spending
has.
with
Thank you.
And the rest of the
you.
museum here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you, Richard, and thank you, Eileen, for this marvelous interview. I just want to make a special note that there is a catalog for this exhibition, and that catalog can be ordered online, or you can stop in at our galleries in the PAR-TV Center and pick up the catalog. If you would like to order it online, it is available at umt.edu/Montana Museum. umt.edu/Montana Museum. We hope you'll enjoy this beautiful addition to the exhibition. Thank you.